Hey everybody, Koricon here, and we're going to talk about They Shall Never Grow Old, which is a new documentary by Peter Jackson that was made to commemorate the end of the First World War, which ended in November of 1918, and so it was released limited through, I think, Fathom events or just limited screenings in November of 2018. So 100 years later. It was commissioned by some of the museums and the archivers of the footage from World War I, along with interviews they did with the veterans that were there that they did in the 60s and 70s. This was an amazing documentary. I usually do spoiler-free reviews, but I mean, there's not much to spoil. It's based on a historic event, you know how it ends. So I'm just going to talk about it a bit. The documentary starts out with the original black and white footage that was in like a 4:3 ratio. So it was filmed with old crank cameras that you had to crank it. And that makes it difficult to restore because the frame rates are different. Sometimes it's 10 frames a second, sometimes it's 13, 14, or 18 frames a second. And they wanted to restore it at 24 frames a second so that it moves smoothly and looks realistic. Because when it's filmed at a lower frame rate and played back, everybody is moving very quickly. Now, at the end of the documentary, you want to stay after the credits. Because after the credits, they have a half an hour documentary on the behind the scenes of how they made it. And that was so interesting, seeing how they got it to 24 frames a second and how detailed they had to be, because if they were one frame off on either side, it would look a little off, and they show that comparison. Also, how they did the colorization, because I agree with Peter Jackson in that you should not colorize black and white movies because they were filmed in black and white for a purpose. They utilized things to make it look good for black and white, and it was the director's artistic reasoning for doing that, or expression. So colorizing that, don't do. Just leave it black and white. That's how it was supposed to be seen. But with war footage, he made a good point of, if you hand the people two cameras and say, this one's black and white and this one's color, which would you want to use? They would obviously use color, because there is no artistic expression. They're just there to document the war. And so colorizing it, making the frame rates 24 frames a second, made it feel more real. They also added a lot of Foley, sound Foley, and even found lip syncers to see what the people in the film were saying, and then brought in actors to recreate that speech so that you can see and hear what the soldiers were talking about. Like, oh, we're going to get our picture taken, you know. Or there was one scene where the guy was reading, you know, a thing to all of his troops, and they had that whole thing going on, which that was really interesting how they figured that one out. But they even got so detailed as trying to figure out where that soldier's company was from so that they can match his accent in England from where he came from. I mean, the amount of detail that they went into for this was incredible, and it took 4 years to do it. I was blown away. But not just that, they originally had a 6-hour cut that had so much information in it, like the women that had to go into the factories and work, and that a few years later they got the right to vote. People that were in the British colonies at the time, like India, some Chinese, and some New Zealanders, Australia. Just a bunch of those were included in the war because Britain was in the war. And I would like to see those stories about the Indian soldiers, the American soldiers, the Chinese soldiers, the Australian and New Zealand soldiers. But they focused on the British soldiers because they had a lot of interviews from them. And there is no current narrator. Like, you don't have David Attenborough giving you a narration of the film. The only audio they have are the interviews from the veterans that experienced it and what their experiences were. So they started out with, getting recruited, going through boot camp, getting all of their stuff, shipping out to France, and then their experiences throughout the war in the trenches, and then the end of the war, and then going back home. So they cover the entire gambit of the war. And there were so many things in there that I'd never thought about. Little details they pointed out, like when they needed to cook something or boil water, they would need to use little slivers of wood to make the fire so that there wasn't any smoke. Because if they had smoke, it gives away their position and they would get bombed by the Germans. So they had to be really careful about that, like where they slept, how they went to the bathroom, how they handled the injured. Now, if you are queasy with violence, you might have a problem with this movie, this documentary, because they do talk about and show dead bodies, people that were in the infirmary or the area where the nurses and doctors were taking care of them. So you see people with bullet wounds. You see people with gangrene feet that need to get amputated. You see one guy that has a chunk of his arm off and the doctor's like holding it. So they don't hold back. And that's one of the things I really like about this documentary. They don't just show the PG-13 version of it, or the PG version of it. They don't show the propaganda of the British soldiers being the heroes and everything is okay. They show the nitty-gritty and they get into it deep. So I was really impressed. You start out with about 20 minutes of that original black and white footage, so you get to see what it looks like. And then there is when they get into France and starting to do the war, they have a slow blend that goes from the black and white, it expands out, and then the color grade comes in. And I vocally was like, whoa, it was that incredible. So I highly suggest watching this documentary. If you can get to the theater, it's worth going for the movie ticket, because seeing it in the theater on the big screen with the good speakers and the sound, so worth it. Totally go, and make sure you stay after the credits to watch that documentary. I'm going to give They Shall Never Grow Old an A. The only reason I'm not giving it an A+ is because I wouldn't mind a longer documentary that had more information in it. But I do understand why they wanted to just focus it down to an hour and a half, because people don't want to watch a 6-hour movie in the theaters. I totally get that. I would like to have seen the color grade come in sooner. It seemed like it was black and white and 4:3 for a lot longer than it needed to be. But I understand the moment that they wanted to do it. So there's things that I understand why. It's just preferences that I would have liked to see. So that's why I give it an A. But my friend Matt Kohler that saw it, and I'm doing a long, like half an hour review with him that will be coming up tomorrow, and I'll have a link to it in the description. He gave it an A+. He was blown away as well. So go see it in theaters if you can. Links to all of my stuff is in the description below. You can check that out, and I will see you on the next video.